With a basic understanding of what arguments are now under our belts, we're going to take a look at a key distinction between two broad types of arguments. So, goals of this lesson: recognize the key features of inductive and deductive arguments, the two types we're going to focus on, and to distinguish the deductive arguments from the inductive ones. So we can distinguish these two broad types of arguments by the degree of support the premises offer for the conclusion. With deductive arguments, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. The difference is, with inductive arguments, there's no guarantee. The truth of the premises merely makes the conclusion more likely to be true. So let's look at this distinction in a little more detail with a couple of examples along the way. First, what does it mean to say that the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion? Here are a couple of different ways you can understand that idea. So the same thought can be expressed this way. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Or alternatively, if the premises are true, then it's impossible for the conclusion to turn out false. So note that these are conditional claims. That's what that if is doing. They tell us what has to be the case on the condition that the premises are true. Then the conclusion will also have to be true. It's common to say that good deductive arguments are truth-preserving, because if the premises are true, the conclusion will also be true, preserving the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. So that'll be the case with any good deductive argument. Let's look at this example. Premise 1, if the remnants of a hurricane hit New Jersey, there is a risk of flash flooding. The remnants of a hurricane will hit New Jersey, so we can conclude that there will be a risk of flash flooding. So if those two premises are true, it must be the case that there's a risk of flash flooding. Of course, you could show me that one of those premises, premise 1 or premise 2, is false. But what matters for the argument to be deductive is that if they're true, that conclusion, there will be a risk of flash flooding, must follow from those premises. That's not the case for inductive arguments. As I said before, with inductive arguments, the truth of the premises provides some support for, but does not guarantee, the truth of the conclusion. So if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true. But even if all the premises are true, it is possible for the conclusion to turn out false. Another way of saying this that you'll see in philosophy is that it's contingent that the premises follow from the conclusion, contrasting that with deductive arguments where it's necessary that the premises follow from the conclusion. So here's an example argument of the inductive type. Premise 1, when the remnants of hurricanes hit New Jersey, there's usually flash flooding. The remnants of a hurricane will hit New Jersey. From those, we conclude there will be flash flooding in New Jersey. For this inductive argument, the conclusion is more likely to be true if those premises are true. Since the remnants of hurricanes usually cause flash flooding, and the remnants of Ida are hitting New Jersey, it's very likely, though not guaranteed, that there will be some flash flooding. So let's look at these two example arguments again. While the topics of these arguments are the same, and their premises have pretty similar content, there are enough differences in their form and structure to make a difference to the degree of support the premises offer for their conclusion. So in that first one, it's deductive. We know that if those two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. By contrast, in our second inductive argument, The argument is reasoning on what's usually the case. The conclusion is more likely to be true given the premises, and even very likely to be true given those premises. But it's possible that even if the generalization in premise 1 is true, and the remnants of a hurricane hit, could be that the weather remains relatively mild and there's no flash flooding. Another way to capture this distinction between these two types of arguments is in terms of defeasibility. Deductive arguments are indefeasible. Since the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, you cannot make the argument go bad by adding more premises. We contrast this with inductive arguments, where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely to be true, but since it doesn't guarantee it, it's possible for new information to undermine the support the evidence offers for the conclusion. So we see here an example of an inductive argument that's defeated by new evidence. The New Zealand storm petrel hasn't been observed for 100 years. On the basis of that premise, people had concluded that the New Zealand storm petrel was extinct. This was a reasonable inductive inference. But then someone photographed the bird in 2003. So the fact that no one had observed the bird in such a long time was good evidence that it was extinct. But since it was an inductive argument and didn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, it was possible for new evidence from a new observation to defeat the original argument, so that the lack of observations for all that time no longer even showed that the bird is extinct. It just turned out that the evidence of no observations was just possibly that the bird was very rare or nearly extinct. But the photograph was enough to defeat this argument. Now, we want to be able to say not only whether an argument is inductive or deductive, but also to evaluate whether arguments are good ones or bad ones. With inductive arguments, we use strength as the measure of support the premises offer for the conclusion. So inductive arguments may be either strong or weak, and a strong inductive argument is one where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion very likely to be true, and a weak inductive argument is one where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion somewhat more likely to be true, but not much more. So here's an example inductive argument. I've never seen it snow in New Jersey in September. It's September. It won't snow in New Jersey this month. Since this is an argument that relies only on my limited personal observation, it's a relatively weak inductive argument for that conclusion. A stronger version of this argument that takes a similar form might appeal to 100 years of meteorological records. So at this point, I suggest pausing the video and reading through each of these arguments. See whether you can tell if they are inductive or deductive. The first argument. The situation in America today is much like that of ancient Rome before its fall, in that the US is controlled by a small group of self-serving individuals. It's inevitable that within 50 years, America will suffer the same fate as Rome. We should see that this argument is inductive. Despite the writer's use of the word inevitable to suggest certainty, it's reasoning that since there are similarities between the US and ancient Rome, it's likely that the US empire will decline in ways that the Roman one did. But it should be pretty clear that there's no guarantee that this parallel will be fulfilled. Our second argument here. Last time I ate here, the shrimp dish I ordered was disgusting. It must be the case that this restaurant buys lousy seafood. So this argument reasons what's likely the case, given that what's been the case in the past. It's a pretty weak inductive argument. The third one. Irene likes either coffee or tea in the morning, but she doesn't like tea. Therefore, Irene likes coffee in the morning. This third argument is deductive. As long as it's true that Irene likes one of those drinks, and it's true that she doesn't like tea, it has to be the case that she then likes coffee. Our fourth argument. These mushrooms have a very similar appearance to the ones growing in the garden. The ones in the garden are edible. The conclusion is therefore warranted that these mushrooms are edible. Like the first argument, this argument relies on making an analogy to offer support for its conclusion. The fact that the mushrooms are similar leads this individual to conclude the mushrooms in front of them are likely edible. And you might reasonably worry that since this evidence is no guarantee, this person probably shouldn't eat those mushrooms. And our final argument. My birthday is 6 days after my sister's birthday. My birthday is on the 12th, therefore my sister's birthday is on the 18th. Now this is a pretty simple argument. It's the simple math of it that makes it deductive, because the mathematical facts guarantee the truth of this conclusion. I do want to note, though, that the study of formal tools for deductive validity that we'll start looking at in the next part of this lesson and throughout the first half of this course won't extend to capturing arguments like this one that depend on the certainty of mathematical facts. So far in this lesson, we've given the distinction between inductive and deductive arguments a brief gloss. And in the next part of the lesson, we'll dive more into what it means for deductive arguments to guarantee the truth of their conclusions. And we'll also look at the core concept for distinguishing good deductive arguments from bad ones. So we've looked at how to distinguish good inductive arguments from bad ones, at least very generally. And in the next part of this lesson, we'll focus on what makes deductive arguments good and bad, and that will be the focus of the first several weeks of this semester.